Okay, pathology, neoplasia. If you haven't been to this section of the book a couple times, then you're doing something wrong. Because you definitely need to make a couple visits to this page. There's a lot happening just in this section alone, and it's really not that easy to get through in one sitting either. I would highly recommend saving a couple things from this page. I mean, from this section, because, for example, I have this one tabbed out separately, right? The Oncogenes, because you will get so many questions on Oncogenes, right? Different ways of presenting the question as well, where either the question is going to try to test you between Oncogenes versus tumor suppressor genes, or they're going to name specific ones, right? And they can name any one of these or describe associated conditions to any one of these. Right, so for example, if someone mentions osteosarcoma, you need to immediately think of RB, and then remember that it's a tumor suppressor gene that works with the E2F, right, blocking G1 to S progression. So remembering each one of these is quite a thing, and it takes a lot of effort, right? It's not really something you can drill into your mind, nor is it something that you can just print out and, reiterate to yourself every single day until you memorize it perfectly. It's more of a repetition thing, right? Every day you would look at a different one of these genes and master it every single day, and that's really going to be one of the many things that you'll have to be doing in step 1 preparation. So first day you could literally start with ALK, do all the oncogenes, master ALK, understand how it works, what it's for, and then move on the next day to BCR, ABL, and so on, because you do have to memorize all of these oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes, all the cancer-related genes, very well, because you can get a question on any one of them. Now, of course, some are much more high yield than the other, but that doesn't mean that the other won't be on your test, right? So you don't, it's up to you if you want to take that risk of memorizing only a few over the others, but any memorization is better than nothing. So you definitely have to spend a lot of time over there. Now, over here right now, first thing they talk about is neoplastic progression, right? So this is something pathological that every pathologist has to be really good at and be able to explain. And you, as a doctor, have to be able to look at pathologies and understand what's going on in a patient. So they have these drawings, and then they have this actual histological slide, which is genius of a slide too, because it literally has full progression from left to right. So let's take a look. Neoplastic progression is uncontrolled monoclonal proliferation of cells, can be benign or malignant. A very big difference that pathoma helps you understand, but I'm going to talk about it too. Any neoplastic growth has two components, parenchyma and supporting stroma. Right, so the parenchyma part is the neoplastic cells, whereas the supporting stroma is the non-neoplastic stuff. So, for example, blood vessels, connective tissue, and this is pretty important, right? So basically, no cancer can grow if it doesn't have the supporting stroma, right? Tumor cells can't keep proliferating if there's no blood supply for that tumor cell, right? So the supporting stroma, though, the blood vessels that are bringing nutrients and oxygen supply and all of that, they are not neoplastic, obviously. They're just normal things that are there, and the cancer is utilizing it to support itself. So that's what this breakdown was about, parenchyma versus supporting stroma. So the parenchyma, the tissue that is actually dividing way too actively, uncontrollably, that's your neoplastic stuff. So normal cells have a basal to apical polarity, right? And understanding this polarity is very important. Now, this basal to apical polarity is different for every organ. It's different for every different part of your body. It's different for your skin. It's different for your the cervix. It's different for the penis, and so on and so on. It's very different depending on what layer and what part of the body you're really looking at. But in general, there should be a polarity from the basal to the apical portion, and we're going to see that. We can see it here, but we can see it in almost any pathological image you get, right? So one thing you want to start doing when you're doing practice questions and stuff is you want to start looking at any pathological slide you're given. You want to start looking at it do you see a polarity from the base to the top? And what is that polarity? So you see this normal section here, right? Don't look at the whole middle portion right now, but just compare just this normal section. Compare just this normal section to the very, very far right where you have severe dysplasia and carcinoma in situ. So let me help you make that a little more clear. I'm gonna put a little thing in between. So let's say that I was to block out like this middle portion right here, right? Okay, so now just look at the normal versus dysplasia, and you can now really gain an appreciation for what the basal to apical polarity is about, right? So if you look here, you can see a difference going from down to the top, right? You can see this section, then you have these cells lining over here, then a little bit of a different thing happening here, and the very top, right? So that's what they mean by polarity. There's some kind of organization, there's some kind of change, something's happening. Whereas on the far right, where you have severe dysplasia, there's really no polarity. There's only like a two-section breakdown. If anything, you have this section here, which is pinkish, and then up here, a highly cellular section with a lot of nuclei, a lot of chromatin, etc. But no polarity. There's no organization. There isn't like, okay, we have this layer, that layer, that layer, that. No, there's barely any layers, if anything. Everything's starting to mix together, and it's going to get really, really bad. So that's the polarity thing that they're talking about. You want to be able to make sure you find that basal to apical polarity for every normal tissue, and if you're given neoplastic tissue, make sure you're able to appreciate the lack of polarity. Right, so this is the cervix. This is a cervical example which shows normal cells and a spectrum of dysplasia as you go from left to right. So the next step you have right here is mild dysplasia, where you can still appreciate some polarity. There is still polarity. There's this layer, you still have the basal layer of cells lining here, right? They're doing a fine job. Then you have your different layer in between, and the very top layer, which isn't supposed to have that many nuclei, right? As it comes to the very top, it's supposed to be anucleated. So in dysplasia, you're noticing a loss of uniformity in cell size and shape, right? There's also a loss of tissue orientation, which is actually part of the polarity, and nuclear changes. There's more nuclei, right? Higher nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. There's more nuclei in these cells up here than there was supposed to be, right? So you can see a lot of these cells have nuclei at the very top layer. They're not supposed to have it. Some of them look round while the others look squamous. That's another issue, right? So that's the pleomorphism they're talking about in dysplasia. And dysplasia, as we learned in the previous section, is pretty much precancerous, right? Because then after that, you have your moderate dysplasia, which is still the same thing, right? See, moderate dysplasia is pretty much still dysplasia, but getting worse, right? And now here you can see a lot more nuclei, right? All these cells look like a lot of really dark dots, whereas most of it's supposed to be just pink with no nuclei, but it's a lot more now in the moderate dysplasia area. And you're also starting to lose this lining we had, right? Such a nice predominant lining we have at the basal layer. It's starting to disappear now in moderate dysplasia. It's starting to disappear, but has not yet disappeared. It's still dysplasia. Once it disappears, then you're into carcinoma in situ, which is pre-invasive. Right? It's an irreversible severe dysplasia that involves the entire thickness of the epithelium, but does not penetrate the intact basal membrane. Right? So it's only started to disappear. As soon as it's gone, as soon as that basal layer is gone, and now things have started invading, you're in carcinoma in situ completely, where you're going to go on to have invasive carcinoma now, and that's that step right here. Cells have invaded the basal membrane using collagenases and hydrolases, mostly metalloproteinases. Cell-to-cell contacts lost by inactivation of E-cadherin. Now, this step 4 is what you get a lot of UWorld questions on, and your step 1 is going to have questions on it too. So generally speaking, you're going to get a question of one or either two types. Either they're going to ask you, what is it that got rid of this basal layer, right? What helped you get rid of this basal layer? What helped the cancer get rid of that basal layer? The answer for that would be hydrolases, which are, the answer would probably just be a metalloproteinase. Or they're going to ask you, how do cells stop having contact with each other so that there's space in between cells for things to go in, right? And that's supposed to happen with leukocyte extravasation, but here there's no leukocyte extravasation. This is not white blood cells trying to help and go to a site where they need to have some kind of activity. This is cancer spreading places it's not supposed to. So that's happening because you lost E-cadherin. So that's going to be the other possible answer choice you might have to pick, depending on what the question is really asking you. right? And then the last part is metastasis, which involves your the non-neoplastic supporting stroma, right? So spread to distant organs via lymphatics or blood vessels, right? And then this is another really high yield topic. Depending on what the cancer is, you can get questions on what lymphatics you need to watch out for, because you have to oftentimes, if you're going to be removing a cancer, especially with breast cancer, you also have to remove all the possible lymphatics that it might have seeded to. So this is one of the questions that I have from you, Earl, that's pretty much exactly about what we just talked about. So you're saying that a research scientist injects hepatocellular carcinoma cells into the liver parenchyma of an experimental animal. Serial observations show that the tumor progressively proliferates and invades the liver parenchyma to form a large mass. After some time, malignant cells begin to penetrate the vascular basement membrane, membrane invasion, expression of which of the following substances is most likely to be increased in the tumor cells, right? So basically, they took a bunch of cancerous cells, put it into some kind of animal, and then they started seeing that the cancer is starting to spread by invading through the basement membrane. What's helping it do it? And then you have a bunch of answer choices, of which only two are significant: E-cadherin or metalloproteinases. For this question, where they're asking you about invasion into the vascular basement membrane, that's going to be metalloproteinases, right? They help degrade components of the extracellular matrix and the basement membrane, which are composed of laminin and collagens 4 and 7. They also help penetrate the basement membrane. So that's metalloproteinase. For questions that have E-cadherin as an answer choice, that's going to be about getting through cell to cell, and they're going to mention stuff like that. They won't mention basement membrane, right? They'll mention going from one place to another, and that's going to be about E-cadherin. The next page also talks about another topic that's very well done by Pathoma, and basically is the understanding of how a cancer is named, right, and why it's named the way it is. So there's a difference between carcinoma and, of course, just having an OMA at the end, or having carcinoma or sarcoma at the end, right? So this little drawing up here pretty much just gives you the basic understanding of it. So any cancer that ends in OMA is benign. Otherwise, if it has carcinoma or sarcoma at the end of its name, then it's malignant, right? And then you have a bunch of different cancers depending on what cell type they come from, right? A bunch of different cancers down here named based off of benign versus malignant, right? So carcinoma implies epithelial origin, whereas sarcoma denotes mesenchymal origin. So that's another thing you really got to make sure you understand as well, right? Because you're going to have to pick answer choices depending on what a question is showing you, and they might have both answer choices there. So you got to pick the correct one. You can't pick the carcinoma if it's actually a sarcoma. You also can't pick carcinoma or sarcoma if it's actually a benign thing. Then you just pick the OMA, neither of the CAR or SAR. Right? So that's something. But carcinoma is epithelial origin. So that's all you really have to remember. And then everything else malignant is sarcoma. Epithelial origin is pretty obvious as well, right? So we're going to see some of that. For example, blood vessels, angiosarcoma. Right, blood vessels are pretty much epithelial origin because they're just one cell thick anyway, right? But smooth muscle obviously is not epithelial origin, right? So that's going to be mesenchymal, and that's going to be leiomyosarcoma, right? So big difference there. Sorry, wait, what am I saying? Both of these are sarcomas here, but depends on what blood vessel you're actually talking about. To be honest, I've seen angiocarcinoma as well, because that's another thing. But angiocarcinoma is going to have to do with capillaries, because they're one cell thick. That's what I was talking about. But generally speaking, if you're talking about much bigger blood vessels, especially with angiosarcoma, you're going to have questions on the liver, right? The liver has a big issue because they have such a deep and invested vascular system. So blood vessels in the liver are going to be the ones that cause angiosarcoma. But if you're going to get a question on some kind of carcinoma for the blood vessels, it's going to be one that's going to be about capillaries, and they're going to mention that directly to you. Right, so all the examples they've given here for the really malignant guys are actually all sarcomas, right? Because these are all things that are not of epithelial origin, right? Epithelial origin is going to be very obvious. These are all your examples here for your mesenchymal origin. And you can easily look it up online too. You can just Google it real quick to see what cancers are actually epithelial origin, what cancers are mesenchymal origin, and that's kind of what Pathoma helps you figure out. But these are all, no matter what, they're all malignant, right? Because they don't end in just oma, such as over here, right? Hemangioma, leiomyoma, rhabdomyoma, these don't have carcinoma or sarcoma in their name. So these are benign. That doesn't mean that they're not problematic, though. They're still problematic. They can have their own issues because they're still cancerous. They're going to be in parts of your body that are going to be bothersome, right? Because it's not supposed to be there. So you still have to deal with it, but it just means that it's not going to kill you, right? So that's something that means that you can basically deal with it pretty well. Whereas up here, you see the epithelium one, right? The only epithelial stuff you really want to know, and they do a pretty good job letting you know the difference here too. It's just that pathoma is much more invested. They go much more deeper into it, and depending on how much time you have, you can definitely go through pathoma as well. But it's not the most important thing, I would say. Before my step one, I had heard a lot about people doing pathoma and stuff, but I never actually did pathoma myself. So I don't have any notes from pathoma here as well. But I did take a look at it. I did get pathoma before going into my pathology chapter for the YouTube videos. And I did get to take a look at all the different parts of pathoma and what's in it. And it's pretty nice. It's handy. It's definitely going to be very helpful for people that have been struggling with cancer stuff. Right, but just understand the epithelial origin generally has to do with adenoma or papilloma, and that's really all there's going to be on your step one, really. Right, there aren't going to be more things. There aren't going to be more things other than adenoma or papilloma, any kind of papillary carcinoma that you're going to see. Other than that, there really isn't. Like papillary carcinoma is usually going to be something like thyroid related because that's epithelial, etc., etc. Otherwise, most things are mesenchymal, right? So that breakdown of epithelial versus mesenchymal is here, and then the different ways of naming them is here, right? So almost all glandular cancers, any cancer that has to do with the gland, right, it's always denoted some kind of adenocarcinoma because it's epithelial. So benign tumors are usually well differentiated and well demarcated with low mitotic activity, no metastasis, and no necrosis. Right? So no metastasis and no necrosis is really important because metastasis usually means it's malignant, right? Necrosis means something's dying. That's obviously malignant too. We talked about well differentiated in the last video yesterday or 2 days ago, but basically the video right before this really talks about what the difference is between well differentiated and poorly differentiated, right? So well differentiated basically means that the new cancerous cells are just like the normal cells in terms of activity and function, and that's usually a good thing because you don't want it to be a poorly differentiated cell. What happens with poorly differentiated cells is they could start making products that you're not supposed to make, right? And that's what happens with a lot of lung cancers. They start making PTH-related peptide, and so on and so on, and that ends up having issues because that's not the lung's normal function, right? But well differentiated cancers are just going to be the same as the original cells that they came from, and well demarcated as well, right? So they're all contained in a small specific area, and you can just remove the whole thing, so that works out. Whereas malignant tumors may show poor differentiation, erratic growth, local invasion, metastasis, and of course they're resistant to apoptosis, so they're not going to be dying as easily, right? And that's really bad because without the programmed cell death, you're going to have an issue with actually getting rid of cells, and that's exactly what cancer kind of is, right? Your cells don't die. They just keep multiplying non-stop. So the other thing, terms for non-neoplastic malformations include hamartoma and a lot of different hamartomas. Hamartomas are very much usually well differentiated, so disorganized overgrowth of tissues in their native location, such as Peutz-Jeghers polyps, and choristoma, which is normal tissue in a foreign location. And that's a very common thing too. Although the word choristoma itself isn't very commonly used, this description often is, right? So the most common thing we see on step one, gastric tissue located in the distal ileum in the macrodiverticulum. And they'll try to make this look so weird in a question. They'll start mentioning things about a bunch of tissue they're finding and it's somewhere else and it does X, Y, and Z, secretes whatever, but it's not supposed to be there, and you know this. So that's when you know it's a macrodiverticulum issue with gastric tissue being found. Right? And they'll probably ask you like what would be secreted by that tissue, etc., etc. What markers would you find, or what kind of epithelium would it have? So you have to know the lining of gastric tissue as opposed to whatever that foreign location has, and understand that there's a difference there. Right? So that's just hamartomas and choristomas. They show up all the time. These are non-neoplastic, which means they're pretty benign in terms of cancer, but they're still very problematic. Like having gastric tissue in a foreign location is very problematic. You're really going to be releasing a lot of acid in places you don't need acid. All right, so that's your tumor nomenclature. Then there's tumor grade versus stage, right? And the stage is usually a lot bigger of a deal, right? Grade versus stage. Remember that grade. So let's read it first. They tell you differentiation versus aneuplosia, right? So differentiation is the degree to which a tumor resembles its tissue of origin, and this is what we were just talking about. So well differentiated tumors, which are often less aggressive, closely resemble their tissue of origin. They look just like where they came from. Whereas poorly differentiated tumors, which are often more aggressive, do not resemble their tissue of origin. Aneuplosia is complete lack of differentiation of cells in a malignant neoplasm, right? And that's the anaplastic thyroid that Michael is mentioning in the comments. So anaplastic tumors are usually the worst of the type. They're the worst of whatever cancer you're talking about. And you don't want anaplastic tumors because they're usually not something you can fix. Well, you definitely can't fix it, but you usually can't save the person either. And that's when it becomes a problem, depending on what the organ is, really. So grade is entirely based off of differentiation, whether it's well differentiated or poorly differentiated. And you have to remember that because you can get a simple question asking you, oh, a pathologist is looking at some tissue, they're trying to figure out what grade it is, or what would the pathologist use to establish the grade of this tissue. And it's going to be based off of differentiation, degree of cellular differentiation and mitotic activity on histological examination. Ranges from low grade, which is a well differentiated, to a high grade, which is poorly differentiated, undifferentiated, or anaplastic. Right, so low grade tumors are a pretty decent thing. It's okay. It's early stage. It can be fixed. Stage and grade are pretty well related too. So if it's a very late stage cancer, it's probably a very high grade also because it's probably been there for a while and it started differentiating in weird ways. Stage is what really determines survival, right? So this is a pretty nice statement, right? Stage determines survival. Degree of localization or spread based on site. So if you have the same kind of practice question I just mentioned about differentiation and grade, if you have another question about a pathologist trying to figure out the stage of a cancer, that's entirely really based off of how much it has spread, right? Metastasis. So spread to regional lymph nodes, presence of metastasis. Based on a clinical or pathologic findings, so this is denotation, stage generally has more prognostic value than grade. A high stage yet low grade tumor is usually worse than a low stage yet high grade tumor, right? Which, if it's a very poorly differentiated tumor but it's only stage 1, that's okay. It's better than very low grade but stage 4 cancer. Then that's like it's near the end already. Doesn't matter if it's not differentiating in weird ways, things are going to get bad. So you have your TNF staging system, which is basically T for tumor size and for nodal involvement, like lymph nodes, and M for metastasis, right? And then they give this example right here, C, T3, N1, M0, which means this is all clinically established, not by a pathologist, right? So this is established by a doctor who saw the patient, and each TNF factor has its independent prognostic value. N and M are often most important, right? So nodal involvement and metastasis, right? The size of a tumor is the size of the tumor. It's okay. But if it's going to a lot of lymph nodes and there's metastasis to other organs, then your cancer has become really problematic. Next page talks about the hallmarks of cancer, right? So this is a lot of stuff that a lot of people don't really tend to remember very well. It also doesn't really show up on tests much, but it's definitely worth knowing because question stems can mention it. So cancer is caused mostly by DNA mutations that were acquired, and they affect fundamental cellular processes such as growth, DNA repair, or survival. Accumulation of mutations gives rise to hallmarks of cancer, which are this list of stuff. So first one, growth signal self-sufficiency, right? That's really bad, right? Growth signals are supposed to come from other places, and that tells the cell to grow. If you have self-sufficiency, you're basically going to be in control of your own growth as a cell, and that's going to lead to uncontrolled growth because no one's controlling it. It's self-sufficient. So mutations in genes encoding any of these things. Proto-oncogenes. Proto-oncogene means that if you have one mutation, it turns on, right? An oncogene is a gene that can cause cancer. As soon as one of the two copies turns on, the whole cancer turns on. Compared to tumor suppressor genes, where you have two guys fighting against cancer. If one dies, the other one is still going to continue fighting against cancer. When both of them die, which is what the two-hit rule is about, then you can't fight against cancer anymore, and that's when cancer starts sprouting up. So proto-oncogenes, when you have a mutation there, you end up having more growth factors, and some kind of autocrine loop will take place where you just, end up having a bunch of cancer. Proto-oncogenes are usually a lot worse than tumor suppressor issues. Growth factor receptors lead to constitutive signaling, so that's seen in breast cancer. And then, of course, we're going to see that entire list of oncogenes with the signaling molecules, transcription factors, and any cell cycle regulators. All of those issues are usually going to cause growth signal self-sufficiency, and no one is controlling that anymore. So then that ends up being a huge, huge issue. Anti-growth signal insensitivity. That's the opposite of that now. So basically, anything that's supposed to tell you to stop growing, you're insensitive to it now. So you don't notice when things are telling you to stop growing. So that's going to be the mutation in tumor suppressor genes, right? Tumor suppressors are supposed to be like, stop growing. If you're insensitive to it, you don't even hear it say stop growing. And that's the retinoblastoma. And then, of course, this is where you're going to have the ancestration of loss of E-cadherin, right? So remember we were comparing E-cadherin versus metalloproteinases. So without E-cadherin, right, you're going to not be able to have your contact inhibition, right? So loss of E-cadherin leads to a loss of contact inhibition, where one cell tells the other cell, hey, we don't need to grow anymore. And that's seen in NF2 mutations. The other hallmark is evasion of apoptosis. And this time in 2019, they really go into that. There's an entire page dedicated to immune evasion in cancers, with a bunch of new things in there that, I wish they didn't add, but they have. So more shit for step one. Right? So mutation in genes that regulate apoptosis, such as TP53, BCL2, any of those things, if you have mutations on those guys, you're going to have an evasion of apoptosis. Limitless replicative potential, right? So a reactivation of telomerase leads to maintenance and lengthening of telomeres, preventing chromosomes from shortening and cell aging, right? So that's pretty much immortality. Telomerase adds more things at the end of your chromosomes, so that every time chromosomes replicate, you're normally supposed to lose a little bit at the end every time chromosomes replicate, and that's supposedly going to add to aging. Here, with telomerase adding more at the end, is pretty much adding more years to the cell's life. Right, so that's your limitless replicative potential. Sustained angiogenesis, right, which is the non-neoplastic part, right, the ability to have more support. Right, so increased pro-angiogenic factors like VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, or a decrease in inhibitory factors. Factors may be produced by the tumor or stromal cells. Vessels can sprout from existing capillaries, or endothelial cells are recruited from bone marrow. Vessels may be leaky and or dilated, and usually that's what's going to make a certain cancerous area very, very hot. Tissue invasion, again, the loss of E-cadherin, right? That's another place where you pick your answer. Loss of E-cadherin. This is not going to be remember, you pick metalloproteinase as the answer if the question is asking you about going through basement membrane, because metalloproteinases are what break the basement membrane. E-cadherin is what allows loosening of intracellular junctions, so things can go in between cells. Right, so loosening of intracellular junctions, and then metalloproteinases go degrade basement membrane. Cells attach to the extracellular matrix proteins like laminin and fibronectin, and cells migrate through the degraded extracellular matrix, leading to vascular dissemination, metastasis. So that's what you have next, metastasis. Tumor cells or emboli spread via lymphatics or blood, leading to adhesion to the endothelium. Extravasation and homing. Homing is basically like a homing missile. A homing missile is going to a very specific location. It's zoned and targeted. So that's kind of what happens with metastasis. You know where metastasis is going to go for most cancers, because that's where home basically is, right? So we know, for example, with breast cancer, we know as it goes to axillary lymph nodes. So that's the homing site for breast cancer. Prostate cancer, we know, can go to the brain. So that's the homing site for prostate cancer, right? With back pain and all of that. Site of metastasis can be predicted by site of primary tumor, as the target organ is often the first encountered capillary bed, right? And you have your seed and soil theory. Basically, a cancer is only going to go where the road takes it, and the road is your blood vessels, right? So the first blood vessel this cancer is going to come in contact with is the first road it'll take, and then you know where that blood vessel is supposed to go because of anatomy, so you know where the cancer is going to go. Some cancers show organ tropism, right? Tropism, remember, always has to do with being able to grow, right? So lung cancer is commonly metastasized to adrenals, right? Organ tropism. They're able to use other organs for their own growth. Last thing here for hallmarks of cancer is the Warburg effect. The shift of glucose metabolism away from mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation and toward glycolysis. Right? So you're going to use your glucose metabolism not for oxidative phosphorylation, not for making energy, but rather just doing glycolysis and getting energy in that way. Right? So now the dependence on oxygen is kind of gone. And that's a really problematic thing, because hypoxia wouldn't kill those cells anymore. Right, so now this is the new thing in 2019, where they dedicated pretty much an entire page to immune evasion in cancers. Right, they have this image, and this is pretty important stuff, and it was known before too. It's just there wasn't a whole page about it on first aid. So immune cells can recognize and attack tumor cells, and we know that, right? All our immune system, there's a lot of cells in our in immunology. We saw that as well. A lot of cells in our immune system that go find tumor cells and kill them. So for successful tumorigenesis, tumor cells must be able to evade the immune system so that our immune system can't kill them. Multiple escape mechanisms exist, and these are pretty predictable. You didn't need the book to tell you this. Right? One way the immune system won't be able to recognize tumor cells is if they stop expressing MHC. Most notably MHC1, because it's the cytotoxic CD8 positive T cells that go kill tumor cells. CD8 requires MHC1. If the tumor cell no longer has MHC1, your CD8 positive T cells won't recognize it and it won't kill it. So that's your first immune mechanism that's getting evaded. The next one, tumor cell secretes immunosuppressive factors, which obviously was another thing that you could have predicted and picked as an answer choice, right? So if you're an immune cell, you should be able to see a tumor cell and kill it. But if the tumor cell suppresses you, then you're not going to be able to work, right? And there's a lot of regulatory T cells and TGF-beta as well as interleukin 10. Interleukin 10 attenuates the immune system. So TGF-beta is going to be released by tumor cells, and also tumor cells recruit regulatory T cells to downregulate immune response. So tumor cells are very smart. They're doing their job to survive, which is kind of what humans are made to do, right? Humans are made for survival. And we're actually made in a way that we can overcome the theory of survival of the best, right? We don't need survival of the best anymore. If there's a human that's incapable, we're able to help each other, or we're able to create things to help ourselves, right? So people that have poor vision, for example, aren't all going to die out because we were able to make glasses. People that aren't physically adept aren't all going to die out because we made things easier, so you don't need to be physically adept. No one is walking cows anymore. We have people that do walk cows, and then I, for example, don't have to do any herding or farming or etc. So humans are completely made for being able to survive no matter what the condition is. And this is one of the things tumor cells are still doing, right? Tumor cells are human cells pretty much, and they're able to evade immune attacks by recruiting things that would stop the immune attack, changing their own receptor. And then this third one, tumor cells upregulate immune checkpoint molecules, which inhibit the immune response. So what this one means is that immune checkpoint molecules are supposed to be those guys that were making sure you don't have too much autoimmunity, right? In the thymus, there was the positive regulation, negative regulation, all of that. Upregulating that inhibits the immune response because you're doing too much negative regulation now, so you're pretty much killing off all your own T cells in a sense because you think all of them have too much self-affinity. That's a problem. And if you killed off all your own T cells, there won't be T cells to go kill the tumor cell. Right? So this one is the less common one. The most common are the first two things that happen. And then they go on to tell you more about these immune checkpoint molecules, so immune checkpoint interactions. Signals that modulate T cell activation and function lead to decreased immune response against tumor cells. Targeted by several cancer immunotherapies. And then they're going to mention brand new medications, which really freaks people out. Right, so interaction between PD1, which is on T cells, right here. Interaction between PD1 and PD ligand 1 or 2 on tumor cells or immune cells leads to T cell dysfunction. inhibited by antibodies against PD-1, such as pembrolizumab or nivolumab, or antibodies against the one on the tumor cell, these three guys, atezolizumab, durvalumab, or avelumab. Really weird names, as usual, for monoclonal antibodies, but the thing is, you've probably never seen these guys before. Never seen these guys before. And unfortunately, there's two different groups. There's the PD-1 group for your own T cell, and the PD ligand group for the tumor cell. Really no easy way to memorize them, to be honest. There's nothing you can do at this point, so, hopefully you'll get a really easy question and you'll just be able to pick correctly. But, it's very unlikely that your step 1 will even ask you a question about any of these monoclonal antibodies, but just understanding the concept is important, right? So we have this PD-1 and PD ligand on tumor cells. If these guys connect, this is going to upregulate T cell checkpoints, and T cells are not going to work too well. So just remember PD-1 and PD ligand. The other thing is your CTLA4, which is also on T cells right here. Right? So normally when T cells connect with antigen presenting cells, there's a CD28 and B7 connection, and that helps things work out. If the CD28 and B7 don't connect, then you're unable to go ahead and do the co-stimulatory signal, right? We talked about the co-stimulatory signal in immunology. It was a very important and necessary signal for things to go forward. But CTLA4 competes with CD28 to bind with B7. So if the CTLA4 connects with B7, there will not be any immune system attack. So what you need now is another medication that kills CTLA4, which is this ipilimumab, right? So another medication being mentioned. Not the most significant stuff, I'll definitely say. I obviously have never seen a question on any of this, but it can be on step 1. And hopefully when it is on step 1, you'll either somehow godfully remember the name of the medication. Otherwise, the question won't even be about the medication, and it'll be more of a mechanism thing, right? So something that competes with CD28 for B7, or something that connects with the ligand on the tumor cell and inhibits T cell activation. You see? Whatever PD-1 is, connected with the PD ligand on the tumor cell and inhibited T cell activation. Whereas over here, CTLA4 competes with CD28 and connects with B7, also inhibiting T cell activation in a different mechanism by avoiding the co-stimulatory signal. And that's all they talk about right there. This is pretty common too. I've seen questions asking about the most common cancer. So first thing first, skin cancer, right? Basal skin carcinoma is the most common cancer. The most common cancer, right? Basal cell skin carcinoma, then squamous, then melanoma. So above all of these other cancers, skin cancer is the most common cancer. Great. Then you have a division between cancer incidence and cancer mortality. Right? So what cancer occurs the most commonly in men? Prostate cancer. Almost every man after age about 50 will have BPH, and then it can lead to prostate cancer. And the most common cancer in women? Breast cancer. The most common cancer in children, and when you do hem-onc, you'll see it. It's just a bunch of leukemias, right? Then when you do neurology, you also see a lot of CNS tumors that are for also kids, right? Children is up to age 14. So that's, none of this is really ridiculously hard to memorize. These are your cancer incidences. Number 2 and 3 are the same for both genders, lung and colon. Oh, where'd you get that from? I wouldn't even really worry too much about it though, because there's just there's already too much to know, and really hoping that you won't get a question on this is the only way to go. Just understand the mechanism more than try to okay. No, yeah. I haven't tried making any way of memorizing it either. I feel more comfortable just understanding how the whole thing works than trying to memorize monoclonal antibodies. They're the worst medications to memorize because they're always named so badly. Right? They're named such weird ways. It's like, what is Pembro? Right? What is Nivol? And Atezo and Durva, these are all sounding like names of really weird gangs or something, or some kind of weird god or something. It's so silly. I don't know why they name medications in such a hellish way. Alright, so that was cancer incidence. Now, they tell you a little thing here, which is pretty important to understand. Lung cancer incidence has decreased in men, but has not significantly changed in women. And this is not related to smoking. This decrease in incidence is not related to smoking. Other reasons people can get lung cancer is also occupational lung cancer, right? Depending on where you work with the silicosis, asbestosis, all that stuff. So lung cancer incidence is only decreased in men because many men have either one, stopped working at such occupations, or the healthcare system got better at making sure people who were working in such occupations were more careful. Right? So that's why lung cancer incidence in men has decreased. But if this was recalculated for lung cancer simply related to smoking, which is really hard to do anyway, then the lung cancer incidence will pretty much stay the same. All right. Cancer mortality also makes sense. Very few people die from prostate cancer, right? And breast cancer, yes, it kills a lot of people for sure, but usually because of, regular mammograms and stuff, we catch it at an earlier stage and hopefully just resect the breast cancer. So what people do die from is lung cancer. Lung cancer is the #1 cause of death in both genders. And of course, children die from the cancer, whatever the cancer they get. So leukemia, CNS, neuroblastoma, done. Cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States. The #1 cause of death in the United States is heart disease, right? Atherosclerosis of your coronary artery, and you get a heart attack and you die. So those are patients that aren't taking their statins because they just don't want to. This is not the hardest stuff either. Common sites of metastasis. I wouldn't try memorizing any of their little mnemonic stuff here. It's always going to be very straightforward. So first thing they tell you, most sarcomas spread hematogenously. Remember, sarcomas were your mesenchymal origin. Most carcinomas, which are your adenocarcinoma, and what was the other one? And papilloma, right? Any adenoma or papillomas. Adenocarcinoma or your papillary carcinoma. All those carcinomas which are epithelial origin, they spread via lymphatics, right? But there are 4 carcinomas that actually route hematogenously, and that's what you're going to get tested on, because if you remember carcinoma lymphatic, then you're going to get it wrong. So if you have follicular thyroid carcinoma, choriocarcinoma, which is related to pregnancy, renal cell carcinoma, and hepatocellular carcinoma, 4 cancers that are obviously very high yield for step 1. All 4 of these guys also spread hematogenously, not lymphatically. Other than that, adenomas and adenocarcinomas, almost all adenocarcinomas are spreading lymphatically. So that's not so hard at all. There isn't a single adenocarcinoma that they mention here that spreads hematogenously. And then all sarcomas spread hematogenously. So not so hard to remember that at all. Just make sure you do study it. And then they tell you about the brain, liver, and bone, right? So what cancers will metastasize to the brain? And they have lung, breast, melanoma, colon, or kidney, right? These are the ones that metastasize immediately, primarily to the brain. So if you have a primary lung cancer, it can metastasize to the brain, just because of how the blood vessels are organized. So 50% of brain tumors are from metastasis, commonly seen as multiple well-circumscribed tumors at gray-white matter junctions. Right? So multiple areas of tumor in the brain is usually because it came from another place. Otherwise, a brain tumor will usually just be in one area, and depending on what kind of tumor it is, that'll determine what the area is. Right? So multiple places of involvement will tell you that it came from a metastasis. And it's going to be at the gray and white matter junction, as they show you here. Right? Not entirely just gray matter, not entirely just white matter. But remember, if it was a primary brain tumor, it would probably just be a tumor of all gray cells or just all white cells, right? Not just one, not a mixture between the two. For liver metastasis, any colon cancer, right? Remember, a lot of your things that you eat do go to the liver. So obviously the whole portal system and a lot of blood supply also goes from your colon to the liver and your stomach to the liver. So liver is a site of metastasis for a lot of cancers that are very common for us. Right? So liver and lung are the most common sites of metastasis after the regional lymph nodes. And again, with the liver, also you're seeing multiple areas of cancer, not just one well circumscribed area, so you know if it was a primary liver tumor, it'll be one area and it'll be well circumscribed for the most part. Bone, everyone remembers prostate, right? Because prostate cancer, then you have back pain, and then because it's a valveless system of blood supply from your back up to your brain, it can go to the brain as well, right? So prostate, bone cancers can also go to the breast, and then thyroid and lung. Bone metastasis is more common, much more common than primary bone tumors, right? Primary bone tumors are going to be related to, like bone metastasis, you see this in multiple myeloma as well. Predilection for axial skeleton, and the axial skeleton is like your main, your entire vertebra, and then your arms and legs, and this area right here, right? But not ribs for the most part. Axial skeleton. Bone metastasis can be lytic, blastic, or mixed, and we're going to see a lot more of that when we get to musculoskeletal. Musculoskeletal. Right, so lytic ones are going to be like your thyroid, kidney, small cell lung cancer. Those guys are going to go to the bone and actually cause lysis and breakdown of bone. Whereas blastic is prostate. Prostate cancer causes you to make more bone. So that's the kind of bone cancer you'll have there. Whereas thyroid and kidney and non-small cell lung cancer, those guys cause your bones to become more brittle. Alright, so that's just non-small cell versus small cell. There's a big difference between the two cancers and what they make and what they do. So that all gets covered in respiratory pathology, but it's very important to keep seeing it. Right? Breast cancer causes a mixed issue. Right? Some lytic, some blastic bone all over the body. Right? So small cell lung cancer makes bones, non-small cell breaks bones. And just a bunch of pictures to show you all of that stuff. Now this page, there isn't really much for me to say about besides what I told you guys at the start of the video. Pick one gene and just go down the list, and every single day memorize one of the genes until you remember them all as well as possible. Right? So start with ALK. Remember that it's a receptor tyrosine kinase, and it is related to lung adenocarcinoma. And that's it. Right? Keep talking about it to yourself all day today until you have it memorized. So that if you ever get a question and you see ALK in the question stem, you know exactly what the thing is related to. And, of course, if you see ALK in your answer choices and your question stem has nothing to do with lung adenocarcinomas, that's one more answer you can knock out. Now, the difference between oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes I've spoken about already. So basically it was oncogene, just remember, as soon as one allele turns on, the cancer turns on. Oncogenes allow mutations, allow cancer. Right? Oncogenes are supposed to be not working once they have a gain of function. Right? Gain of function. They're not supposed to be working, but once they are working, it will immediately lead to cancer. Right? It's a very high cancer risk with that too. And only if you have two alleles, as long as one guy starts working, he's going to cause cancer, and that's it. Tumor suppressors are always working. They're stopping tumor from happening. If one of them stops working, it's okay. The other guy is still doing his job, stopping tumors from happening. When they both stop working, which is what Knutson's two-hit hypothesis is about, when they both stop working, that's your loss of function in a tumor suppressor gene. Now you have no one stopping tumors from occurring, so tumors can occur. Right? But remember, there's a difference between making tumors occur, which is what oncogenes do, whereas not being able to stop tumors from occurring. So if you're making tumors occur, that's going to be really, really bad. You're going to get cancer. Right? You're going to get a lot of cancerous events. Whereas tumor suppressor genes not working is less problematic, because that just means that if a tumor were to happen, you just couldn't stop it. But no one's actively trying to make cancer happen. Right? But again, both are pretty bad, and both of them will probably have relatively equal chances of cancer. Right? So make sure you memorize all of them. I mean, the ones that are highlighted red are good ones to pick also, but they're really just highlighted red so they can show you what they're talking about in terms of memorization tools. They're all pretty important. You're going to get questions. You're obviously not going to have questions on all of them, but you will have a question on at least two of them. And which two it is, you can't really predict. All right, so spend some good time, memorize all of them. Feel free to pause the video when you do study it and memorize anything else you need. You don't need the chromosome numbers. I just put them there. Right? For some of them, it's easy to remember the chromosome number. For some of them, it is important. Like NF1 and NF2, you do need to know the chromosome number. Right? MEN1, you also need to know the chromosome number. But some others, you don't really need to know the chromosome number at all. It's just information I added into the PDF for my own knowledge, and just in case it would help me memorize something. And this is kind of how questions present. This is one example right here. So a 3-month-old boy is brought to the office by his mother for a routine checkup. He is found to have a right-sided white pupillary reflex. His father was diagnosed with a retinal neoplasm during childhood and had his left eye enucleated. This child is at the greatest risk of developing which of the following neoplasms? And the answer was osteosarcoma. You had to understand from the white pupillary reflex that this was related to the retinoblastoma. Retinoblastoma is the most common ocular tumor of childhood. It usually presents with a white pupillary reflex known as leukocoria, and that gets discussed in neurology and under the eye section, in children under age 5 years. Most retinoblastomas are sporadic and usually unilateral, while the rest are familial and can be bilateral or unilateral. Sporadic retinoblastomas are not at risk for other malignancies, but patients with familial retinoblastoma often develop other tumors, usually sarcomas, later in life. Among those, osteosarcoma occurs most often, possibly because they both are on chromosome 13. Right, so RB is one of your where is it? Right here. It's one of your tumor suppressor genes. It works, and remembering tumor suppressor genes is really easy because they're usually things you've already talked about a lot while talking about mitosis. So one of the things tumor suppressor genes works with is retinoblastoma, and retinoblastoma was also discussed the same place with TP53 in biochemistry. Right, it inhibits movement from G1 to S phase. Right, so it's like a blocker right there, just like TP53. Right, but they have different mechanisms. And right here you can see the connection retinoblastoma and osteosarcoma, chromosome 13. Oncogenic microbes, we just finished all of microbiology, right? And we saw a lot of them had to do with cancer. Epstein-Barr virus, most notably, had a lot of cancers involved. Obviously, hepatitis B and C can cause hepatocellular carcinoma. HHV8 was known for Kaposi sarcoma, and that's all it was really known for, especially in aged patients. HPV, we saw it has an E6 and an E7, two things it makes, which both make it have cancerous properties. And you do need to know what E6 and E7 are about. They actually work with RB and all that and TB53. So when we get to HPV and reproductive, you'll see more about that. H. pylori causes a malt lymphoma, right? That's definitely a really common one. Gastric adenocarcinoma as well. We talked a little bit about HTLV1, but not too much. It's just adult T-cell leukemia. It's not a very common question either. Clonarchus sinensis we did talk about, the liver fluke, cholangiocarcinoma, and then schistosoma, right? For squamous cell bladder cancer, we talked about this with people swimming in water and the snail. The snail was the guy that was the carrier in the water. So what is this question? Okay, 46-year-old Caucasian male who presented with abdominal pain is diagnosed with a rare vascular tumor. This type of tumor is often associated with past arsenic or polyvinyl chloride exposure. And vascular tumors should always ring a bell for angiosarcoma, because that's the one that has to do with blood vessels. And arsenic and polyvinyl chloride, we're going to see carcinogens right here. Those guys are highly related to having angiosarcoma. Immunohistochemical staining of the tumor cells is positive for CD31, which probably doesn't ring a bell for anything. The patient most likely has which of the following conditions? Liver angiosarcoma. Other choices were cavernous hemangioma, pyogenic granuloma, lymph angiosarcoma, which a lot of people picked, and Kaposi sarcoma, and many more. But 76% chose correctly, because remember, the question already told you it's a vascular tumor, so it's safe to say it'll probably be an angiosarcoma. CD31 is PECAM1, right? So everyone remembers PECAM1 for pediasis, diapedesis, right? But CD31 is the harder thing to remember there. A member of the immunoglobulin family of proteins who function in leukocyte migration. Thus, the tumor is from vascular endothelial cells, and the most likely answer is liver angiosarcoma, right? And remembering CD31 is almost like ridiculously impossible, but PCAM1 is the one that you want to remember. The PE for diapedesis, which one of the leukocyte extravasation steps. Carcinogens often show up in questions. They'll mention a carcinogen and expect you to know exactly what the problem is. I've seen a lot of questions on aflatoxins, right? They mention aflatoxin and they expect you to know that it comes from stored grains and nuts, right? NBME is very notorious for using carcinogens in their questions. They'll just mention peanuts. They'll mention peanuts and they expect you to understand that this guy who might be working at a peanut farm or something is at risk of having hepatocellular carcinoma. Alkylating agents, like any kind of oncologic chemotherapy, is pretty obvious what this can cause. Oncologic chemotherapy can cause blood cancers, right? So leukemia, lymphoma. Aromatic amines, like textile industry dyes or cigarette smoke having 2-naphthylamine, these amines, they cause transitional cell carcinoma of the bladder. Also a pretty common thing, right? Many other things cause transitional cell carcinoma of the bladder. Cigarette smoke right here, right? And they don't mention any other because they're not carcinogens. But there are medications that also cause it, and there are medications that the medications that cause transitional cell carcinoma of the bladder. There's stuff you can take with it, like Mesna, to avoid that issue, right? Arsenic is found in herbicides and metal smelting. This can cause angiosarcoma, right here. Arsenic is in cigarette smoke as well, right? Now this angiosarcoma right here is not what happened with this patient. Well, he did have arsenic actually. Sorry, that is mentioned. Yeah, he has. It didn't happen to this patient, but they tell you that this tumor is associated with arsenic and polyvinyl chloride. So once they mentioned arsenic, that also lowered your answer choices to 3 possible choices, of which only 1 was a possible answer choice. Asbestos, when we study asbestos in respiratory, remember that this is more than likely going to just cause bronchogenic carcinoma, not mesothelioma. Mesothelioma requires very, very specific things for the question to tell you, for you to finally pick mesothelioma as your answer choice. Cigarette smoke is a bunch of stuff. It's pretty much systemic, your whole body cancer. Ethanol can cause, of course, liver and esophagus. Just think of alcohol. Ionizing radiation, remember, this is very critical. I was doing rotations once in, I think it was a cardiovascular rotation I was doing, and every time we went into any room that had radiation, we all had to put on this whole gown. But one day, I found a gown that didn't have the thyroid cover, and I actually had to leave. I didn't know that needing the thyroid cover was very important too, but since I didn't have it with that gown, like I didn't pick, it wasn't my own gown. You had to pick gowns that were already there, and I didn't pick the one that had the thyroid cover. So now I'll always remember, like anytime you're in ionizing radiation, you also need the shield for your thyroid, because if you don't shield it, you can get papillary thyroid carcinoma from the ionizing radiation, which would really suck. Nitrosamines, you get questions on people who might have attended like a turkey eating competition, right? High protein, especially very high in nitrates, because smoked turkey is a thing, smoked bacon is a thing. Any kind of eating contest, someone that does them regularly, and then you'll get a question about the person presenting with these weird symptoms, and it's probably because of gastric cancer, right? Radon, I've never seen a question. It's a byproduct of uranium decay. It accumulates in basements, but I really don't know what uranium would be doing in someone's basement. Either way, radon is the second leading cause after cigarette smoke for lung cancer. So I really don't know how radon or uranium got anywhere in these people's basements, but it did. And then, of course, vinyl chloride, which again was mentioned in our question for angiosarcoma. Right, so plumbers. And any of these occupations or any of these exposures can be mentioned in the question, and the question would expect that when you see that exposure, you were able to think of the related cancer. Serum markers, so serum tumor markers. Now these are often given, and a lot of them are pretty non-specific as well. These are often given in questions, and when they're given to you in a question, they expect it to ring a specific bell for a very specific cancer, and then you have to be able to get that correct. Right, so ALK-phos, alkaline phosphatase. Important associations are metastasis to bone or liver, Paget disease of bone, or seminoma, right, because of placental ALP. Remember, we'll get there, but seminoma can have ALP in there too, and it's actually from the placenta, not the baby with the seminoma itself. Exclude hepatic origin by also checking liver function tests and GGT, right? GGT is more so related to the liver. So if only ALK-phos is elevated but GGT is normal, then it's not liver, it's bone. So that's a small thing you have to be able to differentiate, and that's discussed a lot more in GIT. Alpha fetoprotein, right? Always given. If it's going to be high, they'll give it to you, even if it's very unnecessary information, because it can throw you off. AFP is elevated in hepatocellular carcinoma, endodermal sinus yolk sac tumors, mixed germ cell tumors, ataxia telangiectasia, and neural tube defects. And this is the one everyone knows, right? Everyone knows neural tube defects are going to have elevated AFP. That's perfectly fine. Hepatocellular carcinoma, also endodermal, mixed germ cell, and ataxia. Normally made by the fetus, transiently elevated in pregnancy. High levels are associated with neural tube and abdominal wall defects. Low levels are associated with Down syndrome. HCG. HCG is really interesting. They try to throw you off with testicular cancer, right? Because we rarely ever think of HCG being high in a male. But if you have a male with testicular cancer, that will be a male with elevated HCG. So don't get confused if you see that. Of course, and then in women, hydatidiform moles and choriocarcinomas are going to have elevated HCG, right? HCG is produced by the syncytial trophoblast, right? Remember, the cytotrophoblast is for cyte, as in like just division. Syncytial trophoblast is the one that synthesizes stuff, HCG. And we're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to reproductive. The R's are like the last few chapters. These CAs also show up a lot. Right, so CA 19.9 is pretty high yield for pancreatic adenocarcinoma, 125 for ovary. I haven't really seen 15.3 or 27.29, but these are for breast cancer. But I've never really seen them in a question. I've definitely seen these two. Calcitonin is, if they tell you elevated calcitonin, first thing that should ring a bell is MEN, right? MEN syndrome. MEN 2A and MEN 2B both have medullary thyroid carcinoma, and that can have elevated calcitonin. CEA, carcinoembryonic antigen, they tell you right here, is very non-specific. This can be elevated and it really shouldn't mean much to you at all unless they tell you a lot more. So major associations, colorectal and pancreatic cancers. Minor associations, gastric, breast, and medullary thyroid carcinomas. So if you do see elevated CEA, one thing where it's really important is colorectal cancer. In colorectal cancer, when CEA is elevated again, and again, not just originally, but if it's elevated again, then you know you didn't get rid of the whole cancer. That's something that they'll talk about in GIT. Otherwise, the minor association is very irrelevant. Those, like CEA elevation is just such a unnecessary thing. It's very non-specific, so it doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't tell you where the cancer is. Chromogranin is a giveaway for neuroendocrine tumors, and we're going to talk a lot more about chromogranin when we get to neurology. LDH is often high, not just from cancer, but for many other things as well. Can be used as an indicator of tumor burden, as in how bad is the tumor, right? And LDH is high in testicular germ cell tumors, ovarian dysgerminoma, and many other cancers. So again, it's not really going to help you know where the cancer is, but it'll definitely tell you, tumor burden. So how bad is the cancer? How heavily are you burdened by it? NSE is literally just for neuroendocrine tumors. All neuroendocrine tumors are neuron-specific analyase positive. Right, so small cell lung cancer, carcinoid, neuroblastoma. And then PSA. PSA is really pretty useless, right? Because questionable risk or benefit of screening for PSA. Marker for recurrence after treatment. Right, so PSA screening, it's done. Most times it's done, especially after age 40. And definitely in patients who say they're either having difficulty urinating, which obviously could be due to BPH, or new elderly males presenting with back pain, right? Because then you know that they might have prostate cancer that has now gone to the bone, metastasized to the bone. So very important to get that down. Alright, so I think we're almost done with the section now. Let me see. Yeah, last page, right? Last 2 pages. Okay, so let's take a look. Importance immunohistochemical stains. One stain I've seen a lot is Desmond. They love throwing that into a question, right? If it stains positive for Desmond, it should immediately ring a bell for muscle, right? And there aren't that many muscle tumors. GFAP is always going to be either astrocytoma or glioblastoma. Those are the only two where it's really significant. S100 is pretty big. It's a neural crest cell, right? So S100 comes from neurocrescent targeted tumors such as melanoma, schwannoma, or histiocytosis. Vimentin, I haven't seen much either. But it's worth knowing all of them. I mean, you've probably seen all of them at some point. TRAP is definitely been mentioned only once, which is literally just for hairy cell leukemia when we get to the blood chapter. Other than that, these are pretty significant depending on what the cancer is, but useless for the most part because it won't really help you too much, right? If they really aren't giving you much information and they just mention one of these stains, then it'll at least guide you to the organ of interest, but it's not going to really help you get the answer that quickly. P-glycoprotein is a pretty newer thing. I've been seeing questions on this in UWorld for a long time, and now it's been in first aid for some time too now, but not for that long. I remember when I saw P-glycoprotein on UWorld when I was studying, it wasn't in first aid at that time. Right? So also known as multi-drug resistance protein 1, it really just makes tumor cells resistant to drugs. That's really all it does. So classically seen in adrenocortical carcinoma, but also expressed by many other cancers like colon and liver, used to pump out toxins, including chemotherapeutic agents. Right, so this is one mechanism of decreased responsiveness to resistance to chemotherapy over time. Right, so if chemotherapy is no longer working on a certain patient, and it's a chemotherapy that has to do with like medications, not ionizing radiation, then that medication is probably actively being pumped out by this patient, so the tumor cells are not dying to it anymore. Right, so very good at adapting to death. Now, Samoma bodies are a pretty important thing, right? The image they give you in the book is a very high magnification. Here is another image I put here with low magnification of a Samoma body. And it's laminated concentric spherules with dystrophic calcification, right? We talked about dystrophic calcification earlier. Papillary carcinoids, somatostatinoma, meningioma, malignant mesothelioma, ovarian serous papillary cystatin carcinoma, and prolactinoma. This is a way of memorizing it, this thing that they do here. I haven't really thought of any other way to memorize it, so it is kind of how I memorize it as well. But, just memorize it because it's going to show up. And also get good at looking at it in histological slides because you want to catch it. See, this image I put here has a bunch of Samoma bodies in it. It's rarely going to be that common. You'll probably just see like one Samoma body and then a bunch of other shit, and they'll probably throw in other cells that look weird. So make sure that, whatever you see, to make sure it is a Samoma body, you also want to make sure you match it to the possible diagnosis. Because if you're looking at something and it's supposed to be a Samoma body, but the cancer is not one of these guys, then it's probably not a Samoma body, it's probably something else. Cachexia, we talked about a little bit in immunology when we were talking about these interleukins, right? So all of these guys actually mediate cachexia. Weight loss, muscle atrophy, and fatigue, all of these things that occur in chronic disease, which is usually going towards death, right? So cancer, AIDS, heart disease, and COPD. Right? So TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, interleukin-1, and interleukin-6 are all pretty much mediating cachexia. This is a question on P-glycoprotein from UWorld. So in vitro studies demonstrate that tumor cells can become resistant after exposure to various anti-cancer agents. These cells express a specific cell surface glycoprotein with what function? And the answer was ATP-dependent efflux, right? They tell you here, used to pump out toxins, right? So when you're pumping out toxins, that's ATP-dependent. They don't mention it in the book itself, right? So P-glycoprotein is an ATP-dependent efflux pump that removes chemotherapeutic agents and is associated with CD243, which again, it's up to you if you memorize that or not, but at least if you see CD243, which is a really big number, it should ring a bell for tumor resistance to anti-cancer drugs, right? This is a pretty easy question about Epstein-Barr virus, so forget that. These are pretty big. Now, these, I'm getting a little anxious now because the video got long, but I do want to finish it. Paraneoplastic syndromes. These show up. I think the most annoying of these that have shown up pretty often are the ones down here. Right, so I've definitely seen pretty much all of these actually show up in a question, the neuromuscular ones. Right, so let's just go down the list. So the first few, musculoskeletal and cutaneous. And we talk about all of these in musculoskeletal chapter. Dermatomyositis, right? Progressive proximal muscle weakness, Gaucher and papules, heliotrope rash. That's always going to be associated with ovarian adenocarcinoma. Any question you get. Step one, if you get a question on dermatomyositis and they're like, what else would you expect in this patient? You're going to expect ovarian adenocarcinoma. Or at least you're going to check it for them because they can have it, right? So dermatomyositis, you're supposed to note anti-nuclear antibodies and elevated creatine kinase because it is a musculoskeletal issue. But those are not specific. The specific things for dermatomyositis and polymyositis are your anti-Jo1, which is for histidyl tRNA synthetase, anti-signal recognition particle, and anti-Me2 helicase, right? Antibodies to those three things. Histidyl yeah, tRNA synthetase. Alright, so those are your antibodies used for dermatomyositis. Has occult malignancy, which polymyositis does not. Dermatomyositis has these things: Gaucher and papules, a heliotrope rash, as well as the fact that it involves CD4 positive T cells and causes perimesial inflammation. Just a little revision. In contrast to all of that, polymyositis doesn't have Gaucher and papules or heliotrope rash. It only has the muscle weakness, usually involving the shoulders, and it involves CD8 positive T cells causing inflammation of the endomysium, not the perimysium. So those are the major differences between all of that. Acanthosis nigricans, you've probably seen someone with this at some point. It's usually a patient that's very obese. Hyperpigmented velvety plaques in the axilla and neck. You're going to see it at the back of the neck. It's going to be really, really velvety black. Right? Gastric adenocarcinomas and other visceral malignancies are related, but it can be related to anything. This is epidermal hyperplasia causing symmetric, hyperpigmented thickening of the skin, especially in the axilla or neck. It's associated with insulin resistance that can be seen in diabetes, obesity, Cushing syndrome, and PCOS. So all of those are your spectra of patients that can present with acanthosis nigricans. It's not a straight up sign that this patient must have gastric adenocarcinoma. But sign of lesser Chalat is, if you see the sign of lesser Chalat, which is discussed on page 410, so let's check it out, 235. This thing. If you see the sign of lesser Chalat, that is a GI adenocarcinoma or some kind of visceral malignancy, but usually on step 1, if you see it, it's going to be a GI adenocarcinoma. It's a sudden onset of multiple seborrheic keratoses. The last thing that isn't discussed anywhere in the book is hypertrophic osteoarthropathy. Right? Abnormal proliferation of skin and bone at distal extremities only. So you see clubbing, arthralgia, joint effusions, and periostosis of tubular bones. Usually related to adenocarcinoma of the lung. Remember that we just talked about lung cancer and how it spreads to axial skeleton. So that's kind of what's happening here. Endocrine, very high yield, shows up a lot, but thankfully most students have already memorized some of this. So if you have squamous cell carcinoma of anything, squamous is the one related to PTH-related peptide. All right. Lymphoma is the one that actually increases your vitamin D3. Small cell lung cancer is the one that can possibly release ACTH and ADH. And these are all usually poorly differentiated cancers, right? Poorly differentiated because now the cancerous cell does not look like the normal cell, which is why it has functions that are not supposed to be there. And that's why poorly differentiated cancers are dangerous, because they can start making stuff they're not supposed to. Hematologic polycythemia, right? So you're going to note high erythropoietin. This can be seen in pheochromocytoma, renal cell carcinoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, and these two. Polycythemia is usually going to be also presenting, they're not going to tell you it's polycythemia in the patient. They'll tell you things like the patient gets really red when they shower, or they get itchy when they shower because high hemoglobin. And of course, there's also going to be in the labs, they'll probably tell you high levels of blood. Pure red cell aplasia and Good syndrome are related to thymomas. Good syndrome is pretty interesting. Hypogammaglobulinemia. In thymoma, you do so much of your negative regulation that you end up killing off all your immunoglobulins, and that's what Good syndrome is. You don't have any immunoglobulins at all. Trousseau syndrome, right? Is your migratory superficial thrombophlebitis. UWorld has really nice questions where they describe this. I don't have it here. I probably have it in the section where the cancer is. But they'll describe migratory superficial thrombophlebitis, right? Superficial thrombophlebitis. Oh, what did I do? Nodular cord on limb with vascular wall thickening can occur in pregnancy due to hypercoagulability. That's the only time it's not cancer. Otherwise, it's always cancer. Right? So if you see migratory thrombophlebitis, it's cancer. And it is migratory. It'll be in one place sometimes, and then sometimes you're going to get the thrombophlebitis somewhere else. Merantic endocarditis. This is the deposition of sterile platelet thrombi on the heart valves. Sterile. So there's no bacteria on it. And that's also going to be pancreatic adenocarcinoma. In pancreatic adenocarcinoma, you can get a question stem that starts off with a murmur, starts off with something cardiology related, completely not mentioning any cancer, and maybe they'll throw in something like elevated lipase, but chances are low because that would kind of give it away. And they'll tell you that they looked at the valve, the person died. They did a autopsy, they looked at the valve, and it's all platelets and thrombi, no bacteria. That's when you know it's merantic endocarditis, and it was most likely related to pancreatic adenocarcinoma, and you just pick that answer choice. Most patients are asymptomatic, and lesions are detected at autopsy. However, compared to infective endocarditis, vegetations can easily dislodge and are more likely to embolize and cause infarction. Right? So these platelet thrombi can actually just come off the valve, go cause a stroke in the brain, and then the patient will die. And they might have pancreatic adenocarcinoma that didn't even just get symptomatic yet. Remember, pancreatic adenocarcinoma has really poor prognosis because by the time you know you have pancreatic adenocarcinoma, it's probably symptomatic and really bad now, so you can't fix it. Right? Last thing, your neuromuscular ones, probably the hardest ones to memorize. The ones that almost everyone remembers are the last two. Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome is where you're eating all your calcium, right? So you're eating the calcium channel, and that's the one that has relation to small cell lung cancer. Whereas myasthenia gravis, this is more grave, this is more problematic, it gets worse as the day goes on. Here, you have antibodies against the postsynaptic acetylcholine receptors, so you're not even releasing acetylcholine, right? Thymoma. Yeah, that was actually really interesting when I first found that. He diagnosed his own cancer, and he didn't survive either. It was pretty unfortunate, but that's just how medicine is. Now, ones that are harder to remember. So ovarian teratoma. If you get a weird question of ovarian teratoma, this is related to anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, which can actually be an answer choice. You're going to get a patient with psychiatric disturbance, memory deficits, right, language dysfunction, and they're going to throw in all these answer choices, Alzheimer's, blah, blah, blah. But you have to remember that they'll give you something about the patient that really helps you pick not Alzheimer's, right? So in the question I had seen, they mentioned that this woman hadn't had her periods anymore, and she was like 40. So she hasn't necessarily, got any major reason to hit menopause yet. And, I made this thing up, NMDA, so no men or dicks allowed, ovarian territory, right? So ovarian teratoma, NMDA. You just got to remember it. Because it's a silly question. It's usually a giveaway. But if you don't remember it, then you just have no idea and you get lost. Neuroblastoma in kids does have this dancing eyes, dancing feet stuff happen. Small cell lung cancer in adults, I have not really seen a question related to dancing eyes, dancing feet, but both of those can have opsoclonus, myoclonus ataxia syndrome. Right? Neuroblastoma in children and small cell lung cancer in adults. Paraneoplastic cerebellar degeneration, I've seen the UWorld question on. Right? Antibodies against antigens in your Purkinje cells. Right? And then what antibodies are being made is also pretty weird and lame. Like, how would you remember this shit? And they sound like, weird because they're not really related to anything. You've probably never even heard any of these. Small cell lung cancer is anti-WHO. Gynecologic and breast cancers are anti-YO. And Hodgkin lymphoma is anti-TR. So I wrote over here, small cell lung cancer, just think of huff your lungs, anti-WHO or anti-HA, right? Breast and gynecologic is anti-YO, like yo, boobs are nice. So something funny to just remember that shit. And Hodgkin, anti-TR. TR, just think of it as tumor receptor. Hodgkin lymphoma is gonna, remember Hodgkin versus non-Hodgkin? Hodgkin is all gonna be like in one linear area, right? It's all going to be connected, whereas non-Hodgkin can be anywhere in the body, multiple areas. So Hodgkin is tumor receptor. It's all going through a tumor receptor going together, right? So some kind of dumb shit like that. You just got to make things up to remember it, because these are going to be answer choices, especially on NBME. I think I've seen anti-WHO as the answer choice for a small cell lung cancer that has something to do with paraneoplastic cerebellar degeneration in one of the UWorld questions. So it was actually on UWorld as well. And that's really all there is now. So it's just, these are a lot of things that you just gotta spend some time on. And the main thing about all of these principles, except for biochem 2, I guess, all of these principles, the main thing is they show up again as you start doing the organs now, right? So when you do organs and you hear something that's been mentioned in your principles, come back to the beginning of your PDF and search for that word again and find it here and read it again, because that connection you have to make will also increase your repetition of looking at topics, as well as help you truly make a connection so you can see what else is involved. All right. And then in the next video, I'll start going into the big topic of pharmacology and really help you understand how to tackle KM, Vmax, and master it so that you could talk about it without any kind of loss of confidence, right? I was a math major in my undergrad years, so anything with graphs, math, etc. is always super easy for me. When I see a graph, even if it's something brand new, I know what's happening. So I'm going to try my best to help you guys know what's happening when you see a graph and really understand why a graph looks the way it does, depending on various changes. All right, and that'll be the next video we do. So thanks a lot for joining. We're done with pathology, and I'll see you guys when we start pharmacology.